Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling the really kind of controversial topic of gender transition procedures for minors. You guys sent in some really thought-provoking material, and we're excited to get into it.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot-button issue right now, especially with that case going up to the Supreme Court.
Right. And the material you guys sent in includes a speech from Matt Walsh, the conservative commentator. He was speaking at a rally right outside the Supreme Court. Pretty intense setting.
Definitely. And we've also got some of his testimony from a Tennessee House Committee hearing, so we've got a lot to unpack.
Okay, so let's start with that rally speech. Walsh comes out strong right from the beginning, laying down these three core beliefs he has. He says that, first of all, biological sex can't be changed. It's immutable. Then he says that society, our main job is to protect children. And finally, he says that this whole idea of gender ideology is inherently dangerous. And these three things, these are like the foundation of his whole stance on this.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that framing because it informs his whole argument. So when he says men are men, women are women, he's not just talking about biology. He's setting up this idea that trying to change that is wrong.
And tying that to this idea that we have to protect children.
Right.
So it becomes this moral obligation to oppose anything that kind of challenges that natural order.
Right. And that includes anything he considers gender ideology. And he doesn't mince words either. He says that any country that doesn't protect its children deserves to die. Like, wow.
Yeah, talk about strong language, right? He's definitely raising the stakes there. It makes the whole debate feel a lot more serious,
And I think that resonates with a lot of people who share his concerns about the potential for harm, particularly when it comes to children.
Okay, so let's get more specific here. Let's talk about the term trans kids.
Mm-hmm.
Walsh completely rejects that term. He doesn't believe in trans kids.
Mm-hmm.
He says that those kids are just confused and that they're actually victims of abuse.
Yeah, and he even goes so far as to say that there's no historical evidence of trans children committing suicide. So basically, he's saying that the idea that affirming their gender identity prevents suicide is just not true.
And that's where things get really complicated, right? Because how do you even begin to measure something like that?
Exactly. And it's important to acknowledge the nuances here. While there's debate about the direct link between affirming care and suicide prevention, there's also plenty of research that shows transgender youth experience higher rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, things like that, compared to cisgender youth.
Okay, so it's not as simple as Walsh makes it sound. There's a lot more to the story. What about the other side of this, though? What about the people who support allowing these procedures for minors? What are their arguments?
Well, one of the main arguments is about bodily autonomy. The right to make decisions about your own body, even if you're a minor.
So even if you're under 18, you should have a say in what happens to your body.
Exactly. They argue that transgender youth experience real distress when their body doesn't match their gender identity, and affirming care can help with that.
And that these interventions, these procedures, they can actually lead to positive outcomes like less anxiety and depression, better social skills, a stronger sense of self.
Right. It's about improving their overall well-being.
So you've got this clash, right, between people who want to protect children from potential harm and people who want to respect a child's autonomy and their right to make their own choices.
Yeah. And that clash plays out in a lot of different ways, especially in how both sides frame the issue.
And speaking of framing, Walsh is very intentional about how he presents his argument. He's not saying that the Tennessee law is targeting the children. He says it's targeting the doctors and the parents who are making these procedures happen. He even calls them gender butchers and claims that activists are basically fighting for adults to harm children.
It's a strong way to put it. He's painting a picture of these vulnerable kids being exploited by adults, right? Whether those adults are malicious or just misguided.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a powerful message, especially for people who are already worried about protecting children.
Right, but it's also important to remember that this is just one interpretation of the situation. People who advocate for gender-affirming care argue that parents and doctors are acting in the best interests of the child, based on their needs and what they've expressed they want.
So it really comes down to who you believe is acting in the best interest of the child. And that's a tough question, right? Where do you draw the line between parental rights, medical advice, and the state's responsibility to protect kids?
It's the million-dollar question. Courts and lawmakers and families all over the country are wrestling with this, and there's no easy answer. Each situation is different: the kid's age, how mature they are, how much distress they're in, the risks and benefits of each treatment. It's complicated.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've established that this is a complex issue with deeply held beliefs on both sides. But let's get back to Walsh's arguments against gender-affirming care. He's particularly critical of the claim that it reduces suicide rates. He points to a study by W.P. Path, the World Professional Association Foundation for Transgender Health that couldn't prove that link definitively. What's the significance of that point, and how do experts respond to it?
Well, it's true that the WPATH study, which is often cited by people who support gender-affirming care, didn't definitively prove a causal link. However, it's really important to remember that suicide research is incredibly difficult. Isolating specific variables is almost impossible.
So you're saying it's hard to prove that one specific thing, like gender-affirming care, directly causes a decrease in suicide rates.
Right, but there are plenty of other studies that show a strong correlation between gender-affirming care and better mental health outcomes for transgender youth, and that includes lower rates of suicidal thoughts.
Okay, so even if that WPATH study isn't the slam dunk that Walsh claims it is, there's other evidence that suggests gender-affirming care can be beneficial.
Exactly. And we have to consider that alongside all the ethical considerations and the individual needs of each child. It's not about just accepting one side or the other blindly, but really digging into the evidence, understanding all the nuances, and making informed decisions that put the well-being of those kids first.
Well said. Okay, so we've really unpacked Walsh's opening arguments and gotten a sense of his core beliefs. But things really heat up when we get to his testimony at that Tennessee House Committee hearing. It's a whole different level of intensity with some pretty tense exchanges.
Oh yeah, definitely buckle up for that one.
So let's get into it. That's what we'll pick up next time.
I know I have another YouTube channel that this video is more appropriate for than this one, but because I used my phone number twice for my other channels, I'll have to upload it here. If I upload it on my other channel, I hope you remember what I said here.
Okay, so we're back and we're diving into this Tennessee House Committee hearing. We've got Matt Walsh, not exactly known for holding back, walking into a room full of lawmakers. I can only imagine how that went.
Yeah, it's not exactly a recipe for a calm, polite debate, especially with the topic this charged. And yeah, it got pretty intense. Lots of clashes between Walsh and some of the Democratic lawmakers on the committee.
Let's get into it then. So right off the bat, Representative Caleb Hammer tries to use something Walsh said before about marriage at 16 to kind of discredit him. It felt like a classic tactic, try to paint your opponent as a hypocrite so people don't listen to their argument.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a common strategy in these kinds of debates. Instead of tackling the argument head on, they shift the focus to the person making it. But Walsh didn't let him get away with it. He turned it right back on Hammer, asked him straight up if he thought a 16-year-old could actually consent to having body parts removed. Like, whoa.
That's got to be a tough one to answer on the spot. Do we have the clip of that?
We do. Let's hear it.
Okay, here we go.
That silence, though, you could hear a pin drop. Hammer definitely wasn't expecting that. I mean, what do you even say to that?
Yeah, he was totally caught off guard.
It was a smart move by Walsh, rhetorically speaking. He basically backed Hammer into a corner where no matter what he said, it wasn't going to look good. If he says no, then he's agreeing with Walsh, but if he says yes, he's probably going to upset a lot of people who think that's crazy.
So not saying anything was probably the best option at that point, even if it made him look unprepared.
Exactly. It just goes to show how hard it is to have these nuanced, complex conversations in a public setting like that, especially when the stakes are so high. Everything becomes about sound bites and gotchas instead of really thinking things through.
So Hammer's attempt to discredit Walsh didn't really work out so well for him. Did any of the other Democrats have more luck?
Not really. Another lawmaker, John Ray Clemens, tried a different angle. He started questioning whether Walsh was even qualified to talk about this, saying he didn't have the right credentials or expertise.
Ah, the good old credentialism argument.
Yeah.
You see that all the time, right? Especially with these complex issues. It's basically a way to shut someone down without actually dealing with what they're saying.
Exactly. Like, only people with certain degrees or titles get to have an opinion. That's a slippery slope.
So how did Walsh handle that?
He said being a human with common sense and a soul was all the qualification he needed to speak out against what he sees as, and I'm quoting here, the chemical castration of children.
Wow, that's a strong statement.
Yeah, he's basically saying that when it comes to something this fundamental, your moral conviction matters more than having some fancy degree.
And that brings up an interesting question, right? Who gets to decide who's an expert in these debates? Is it just academics, or do lived experiences and personal beliefs matter too?
Big questions. And unfortunately, from what I've seen, the rest of the hearing didn't get much better. It seemed like the Democrats just resorted to reading random tweets from Walsh, trying to make him look bad, and then cutting him off when he tried to respond.
So not exactly a productive dialogue then.
Not really. It felt more like they were just trying to score points instead of genuinely engaging with his arguments. And Walsh definitely picked up on that. He seemed pretty frustrated that they wouldn't have a real conversation about it.
It's a shame, These conversations are so important, but it's hard to get anywhere when both sides are just digging in their heels and refusing to actually listen to each other.
It's a problem we see a lot these days. But hey, it doesn't have to be like that, right? We can disagree with each other without being jerks about it. We can challenge each other's ideas without resorting to personal attacks or trying to shut each other down.
I couldn't agree more. Now, we spent a lot of time focusing on Matt Walsh and his perspective, but it's really important to make sure we're presenting a balanced view here. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about the arguments in favor of allowing these procedures for minors. How do they address the concerns that Walsh and others have raised?
One of the core arguments from folks who support this care is that denying it can actually cause a lot of harm to these kids psychologically. They say that things like puberty blockers can give them valuable time to figure out their gender identity without the added stress of going through physical changes they don't want.
So it's not just about letting them express their gender identity. It's about preventing potential harm and making sure they're okay mentally and emotionally.
Exactly. And they argue that for kids who do decide to go ahead with hormone therapy or surgery later on, delaying puberty can make those transitions easier and less expensive.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the argument that kids are just too young to make these kinds of decisions? I mean, these are big life-altering choices.
Proponents of gender-affirming care definitely acknowledge that these are complex decisions, but they believe they should be made on a case-by-case basis. Working closely with the child, their parents, and medical professionals who know what they're doing, they emphasize that these interventions are not something anyone takes lightly, and there's a lot of careful assessment and consideration of risks and benefits.
And they also point out that, pretty much all medical professionals agree that surgeries for gender affirmation are not done on minors. So the real debate is about puberty blockers and hormone therapy.
Right, and those are considered medically necessary for a lot of transgender youth. Denying them access can have some pretty serious consequences for their health, both mental and physical.
Okay, so the lines are starting to become a little clearer here. On one side, you've got people who believe these procedures are harmful no matter what, and that kids need to be protected from them, even if it means taking away some of their autonomy. And on the other side, you've got people who believe these interventions can literally save lives, and that denying them is a form of discrimination that can do serious damage.
Yeah, that's a good summary. It's a really tough issue with no simple solutions. And it's probably going to be debated for a long time to come. But to really understand what's going on here, we need to look at the science behind gender identity itself.
All right, let's do that. What does the research tell us about how gender identity developed? Is it all in our genes, or is it about how we're raised?
That's the million-dollar question that scientists have been trying to answer for decades, and the answer is, like most things about human development, it's complicated. It's not an either thing.
So it's not as simple as saying it's all nature or it's all nurture.
Right. We know that both biology and our environment play a role, but how they interact is still being studied.
What are some of the biological factors that researchers are looking at?
Well, some studies have shown differences in certain parts of the brain between trans and cisgender people. For example, one study found that the amount of gray matter in some brain regions was more similar between trans men and cis men than between trans men and cis women.
Interesting. So there could be some biological basis for gender identity.
It's possible, but we need to remember that these studies are still pretty new, and we need a lot more research to figure out how things like brain structure, hormones, and other biological factors actually work together to shape gender identity.
What about the social and environmental influences? How do those fit in?
Well, think about it. From the moment we're born, we're bombarded with messages about gender. What boys are supposed to like and do, what girls are supposed to like and do. All of that shapes how we understand and express our own gender.
But if gender is so influenced by society, wouldn't that mean it's more fluid, less fixed than something like our biological sex?
That's a great question. While it's true that societal expectations can influence how we express our gender, a lot of transgender people say they feel a really deep, strong sense of mismatch between their assigned sex and their gender identity, no matter what society tells them.
So it's not just about rebelling against norms or trying to fit in. It's about a fundamental sense of self that doesn't align with their assigned sex at birth.
Exactly. And for many trans people, this sense of mismatch can cause serious distress and make it hard to function in everyday life. And that's where the concept of gender dysphoria comes in.
Okay, let's talk about that. What is gender dysphoria and how does it show up in kids and teenagers?
So gender dysphoria is the clinical term for the distress someone feels when their gender identity doesn't match the sex they were assigned at birth. And in kids, this can look like a lot of different things. They might say they want to be the other gender, insist on wearing clothes or playing with toys that are typically associated with the other gender, refuse to use the pronouns or names that go with their assigned sex.
So it goes deeper than just wanting to wear a dress or play with trucks. It's a real feeling of discomfort and disconnect from their assigned gender.
Right. And for some kids, this distress is so bad that it affects their everyday life, their relationships, their mental health.
And that's where the whole debate about medical interventions comes in.
Exactly. People who support gender-affirming care argue that these interventions can help ease that dysphoria and improve the mental health of trans youth.
Okay, so let's get into those interventions. We've already touched on puberty blockers and hormone therapy, but what do they actually involve and how do they work?
Sure. Let's start with puberty blockers. These are meds that basically hit the pause button on the hormonal changes that come with puberty.
So say you have a child assigned female at birth, but who identifies as male. If they start taking puberty blockers, they wouldn't develop breasts or start their period.
That's the idea. It gives the child and their family more time to figure things out without the pressure and potential distress of those physical changes happening.
And these effects are reversible, right? If I stop taking the blockers, puberty would just pick back up where it left off.
In most cases, yes. But there is still some debate about the possible long-term effects of puberty blockers, especially on things like bone density and fertility. More research is needed there.
Okay, makes sense. Now what about hormone therapy? How's that different?
Hormone therapy involves taking hormones that match the person's affirmed gender identity. So for trans guys, that might mean taking testosterone, and for trans girls, it might mean taking estrogen. These hormones cause physical changes that are more in line with the person's gender identity.
So testosterone would lead to more masculine features, and estrogen would lead to more feminine features. But those changes aren't always permanent, right?
That's right. Some effects can be reversed while others can't. For example, a deeper voice from testosterone is usually irreversible, but breast growth from estrogen can be reversed if hormone therapy is stopped.
So it's more complicated than puberty blockers when it comes to reversing the effects. People need to understand both the good and the bad before making a decision.
Absolutely. And talking to qualified medical professionals is crucial. They can provide guidance, support, and monitor how things are going throughout the process.
And just to be clear, surgeries related to gender affirmation aren't usually performed on minors, right?
That's right. Most medical guidelines and ethical considerations recommend waiting until adulthood for those procedures, when someone is considered more capable of giving informed consent.
Okay, so we've got a better understanding of how gender identity works and the medical treatments involved in gender affirmation. But this whole debate isn't just about science and medicine, is it?
Definitely not. There are huge ethical questions here. Questions about parental rights and about what role the government should have in people's personal decisions.
Wow, we've really gone deep on this one, huh? We've talked about the emotional arguments, the science, Matt Walsh's perspective, that heated hearing. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. This whole debate brings up some fundamental questions about rights, about parents' role, about the government's place in healthcare, big stuff.
And it's clear that there's no easy answer. Both sides make points that are hard to ignore, but hopefully, by breaking it all down, we've at least gotten a better sense of how complex this issue really is.
Totally. And one of the key things I keep coming back to is that every kid's situation is different. There's no one-size-fits-all approach here. Any decisions about treatment have to be made case by case, considering the child's age, how mature they are, how much they're struggling, what the risks and benefits of each option are.
It's about finding that sweet spot between protecting kids and respecting their right to make their own choices. Not easy.
Not at all. And we can't forget that this isn't just some abstract debate. There are real families out there going through this, kids whose lives are directly impacted by the laws and policies being made.
We've talked a lot about the arguments for and against allowing these procedures, but where do things stand legally? What's happening with legislation and court decisions right now?
Well, you mentioned earlier that the Supreme Court's about to hear that case from Tennessee, the one challenging the ban on these procedures for minors. That decision could have a huge impact across the whole country, either upholding these bans or striking them down.
High stakes, then. What are the main legal arguments being considered in that case?
A lot of it centers on the 14th Amendment, specifically the Equal Protection Clause. Basically, it says states can't deny anyone equal protection under the law. Opponents of the bans argue that they discriminate against trans youth by denying them access to medical care that other minors can get.
So they're saying these bans create a different, unequal system of healthcare specifically for trans kids.
Right. And they also say these bans go against the right to privacy, which courts have said includes the right to make your own healthcare decisions, like with reproductive rights.
So they're connecting it to abortion rights, arguing that both involve really personal choices about your body and identity.
Exactly. But the other side, those who support the bans say they're necessary to protect kids from making decisions they'll regret later, especially with medical treatments that can have irreversible effects. They focus on the risks and unknowns, particularly when you're talking about young people whose brains and bodies are still developing.
They also worry about kids being pressured into transitioning, maybe by parents or doctors, even if it's not really what the kid wants.
Yeah, that's definitely a valid concern. It underlines how important it is to make sure any decisions about medical interventions are made with the kid's full understanding and consent without anyone forcing them into anything.
So the legal stuff is just as complicated and nuanced as the ethical and medical sides of this. It'll be interesting to see what the Supreme Court decides and how that affects trans youth everywhere.
Absolutely. It's a landmark case for sure.
Okay, well, we've covered a ton of ground today. Before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you said earlier about remembering the individual experiences of trans kids and their families. What advice would you give to people who want to talk about this issue in a way that's thoughtful and productive?
That's so important. I think the biggest thing is to come to these conversations with empathy and a willingness to truly listen to what other people have to say, even if it makes you uncomfortable or challenges your own beliefs. We can't forget that this is about real people's lives.
It's easy to get lost in the abstract, but at the end of the day, this is about human beings.
Right. And if you're looking to learn more, I'd recommend checking out resources from organizations that focus on transgender health and advocacy. They can give you really valuable information and insights to help you better understand everything we've talked about today.
Great advice. Well, I think we've given everyone a lot to consider. This is definitely not the end of this conversation, but hopefully after this deep dive, you've got a clearer understanding of the arguments, the science, and the human side of this really complex issue.
I hope so too. And keep learning, keep asking questions, keep forming your own opinions.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.